who's Chief Executive and Secretary General of the Association of Commonwealth Universities and a valued colleague of many of us here. Joanna's previously, prior to joining ACU in April 2017, was Vice Principal International at King's College London. Her previous roles have included Director of the UK Higher Education International Unit, which is now known as the Universities UK International, and Head of Higher Education at the British Library. Joanna.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's a great pleasure to speak here. Also, thank you, NSW, for the invitation. So I've been asked to talk about harnessing opportunities, the Commonwealth and higher education, and my first slide shows a dark and sparkling sky. And actually, one of my most inspiring examples, I think, of cooperation in the Commonwealth has to be the Square Kilometre array. I was really fortunate in a previous life to be taken by Julie Bishop, the Australian Foreign Minister, to a disused cattle ranch in the middle of Western Australian desert, which has now become a satellite park, where they are mapping the sky. And this is a cooperation between Australia, South Africa, and other African states. And what's extraordinary about this cooperation is it amalgamates cutting-edge science, cosmology, looking at the origins of the Earth, with projects where the scientists are working with schools and inspiring a next generation of children, not only to think about the sky and origins and science, but also what does it take to map the sky? What kind of equipment do you need? What kind of data is coming through, and what kind of skills do you need to be able to read that data? So not only are they inciting the imagination of a next generation of children in a really exciting scientific project, but they're also creating the next generation of data scientists. So I think that's, in a way, encapsulates the talk that I want to give about the potential and the possibilities of working across the Commonwealth. I'm going to start just with a little bit about who we are, the Association of Commonwealth Universities. We are the oldest international network in the world of universities. There have been many since our founding in 1912. We have a royal charter. The Queen, the head of the Commonwealth, is our patron. And we champion the work of Commonwealth universities. I'm very proud that King's, who were here earlier, UNSW, Jindal, and others are all members of our network. And we convene members internationally for what our founders described as common action in the common interest in the Commonwealth. So who and where are we? We have 530 members, and you can see where they are across the globe. 66% in low and middle income countries and 5% in small states. The ACU also has a responsibility to represent universities to Commonwealth governments. We represent the concerns and interests of our members, and as an accredited Commonwealth organisation, we have formal opportunities to leverage our members and their knowledge and expertise to take part and interact in Commonwealth political processes and influence the policy agenda. So I was recently in Uganda at the Commonwealth Youth Ministers Conference, which was mainly about issues for youth and tertiary and skills, but it was absolutely fascinating to see how 32 ministers of state came together. The UK, unfortunately, didn't send a minister because we don't have a youth minister, so they sent a cabinet an office instead. But it was a really interesting thing to see how policy is formed and how the civil society organisations like the ACU, but also like teachers' associations, youth associations, feed into this process and influence governmental agendas, which hopefully also leads to funding being released for priority areas. Just lastly on the ACU, the third thing we do, which we're extremely proud of, is that we promote global mobility. In 1959, General Marshall, who founded the Marshall Plan, wrote a letter to a group of young scholars from America who came over to the United Kingdom to say, "You represent the future of a planet in a very troubled time. It is only through the interaction, I'm roughly quoting, I don't think I'm quoting it correctly, but it is only through the interaction of minds meeting other minds in diverse situations that we will make, we will increase understanding. And so the ACU has actually managed and administered the Marshall Scholarship Plan ever since. We also administer the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission and the Chevening Scholarships for the UK government. That's roughly about 3,000 scholars coming to the UK every year from across the globe. With the Chevening, it's 160 countries. But we also have, because we're an old and distinguished organisation, many legacies and bequests, which is a fantastic way that we can also increase mobility with our own small grants. And I imagine, or I hope, that many of you representing member institutions here have applied and received grants for attending PhD workshops, summer schools, spending time in other universities as part of the titular fellowship scheme, or just to attend conferences. So the question that I'm asked all the time about the Commonwealth and harnessing opportunities is, gosh, it's a good time that you've joined the ACU. It must be really interesting now with Brexit happening. You know, what are the opportunities? Great time to be in the Commonwealth. Well, I mean, I think it depends on your perspective. I have to point out that the ACU is an international organisation representing 52 different countries and 530 members in those countries. And from the perspective of the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Commonwealth itself, it's a bit of a wait and see, because it depends on the position of the UK within the Commonwealth family once the Brexit negotiations have been determined, to know whether actually it will be advantageous to work with a British university or indeed a university in another European country. And I'm sure, Simon, I wasn't here earlier this morning, but you covered some of these issues. So it's not clear yet how the rest of the Commonwealth will regard this newfound interest from Britain. And we certainly can't expect to assume that the other 51 member countries will necessarily welcome it. I have heard occasionally UK politicians talking about Empire 2.0, and of course this is extremely unwelcome. So for the next half hour, I'd like to avoid the murkier waters of trade deals and single markets, and waters that our politicians are, of course, struggling to navigate, and instead look at the Commonwealth as a force for global good and its inherent potential, both as a framework for cooperation and in influencing the global policy agenda. And if we think about how frameworks work in bilateral ways, they're incredibly successful. UUKI, I think Vivian Stone is here later, will talk about how the UK and India, for example, have a very successful relationship through UKIERI. There are UK-China links. Australia has very successful bilateral links, most countries do. But I think there is also a case, which I will be making, for multilateral links, and I'll make some suggestions in how we can move forward with that. So the first point is that in a colliding world, networks are more important than ever before. With the promise and optimism of an ever more connected and globalized world has also come a narrowing of minds and borders. And as we grow more connected, we also seem to be becoming more fractured. As globalization and multiculturalism clash with parochial mindsets, it's given rise to resurgent nationalism, civic unrest, and online platforms used as forums for hate. I'm just thinking if there's a Charlottesville picture in there, but I don't think there is. As one of the founders of Twitter said earlier this year, I thought once everyone could speak freely and exchange information and ideas, the world is automatically going to be a better place, and I was wrong about that. So what is it about the Commonwealth in particular that makes it such a relevant, resilient, and valuable framework for cooperation? And how does it promote that in such a divided world? So I'm going to just give you a few facts quite quickly. It is uniquely diverse. It has countries on every continent, and its member nations are amongst the world's largest, smallest, richest, and poorest. It has global breadth and reach. You know, we are the oldest international university network in the world, but we represent the youngest populations of 2.4 billion. More than 60% are under the age of 30 in the Commonwealth. So it's also the future for education lies in Commonwealth countries. We have, I think the Commonwealth has and Commonwealth universities have convening power. These formal agenda-setting meetings of the youth ministers, the education ministers, the trade ministers, the finance ministers, end with the Commonwealth heads of government meetings, which happen every 2 years. The UK has the chair next April. Theresa May will be holding the chair on behalf of Commonwealth governments for 2 years, after which it will be handed to Malaysia in 2020. I think the Commonwealth also has a vision of equity because it is the only forum that gives small states an equal voice, and there must be about 31 of the 52 Commonwealth countries are small states, some of which are small and fragile states. And there are also communalities and compatibility. The Commonwealth have all faiths. We have all races, cultures, and traditions. And we have a shared inheritance in a common language, laws, traditions, and constitutional frameworks. And despite the fact that much of us may regret the history and facts of the shared history at times, those communalities remain and lead to perhaps a compatibility or an ease of working together. Which brings me to the reason why I think the Commonwealth matters, and it's certainly why the Commonwealth matters to me. The Commonwealth matters to me not because of its past and the history of Britain as an empire. The Commonwealth matters to me because of the values in the Commonwealth Charter that Commonwealth countries ascribe to. And those are behind me. It took a long time, I think, for Commonwealth countries to agree what that charter means. And it's interesting that if you compare those 16 points with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were published in 2015 by the United Nations, you might see a small resemblance there. And in fact, I have heard Patricia Scotland talk, the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, about the fact that there was a lot of work that the UN took from the work of the Commonwealth governments in creating this charter. So I'd now like to move on from the Commonwealth itself to the Commonwealth and higher education and how I think a framework creates invaluable opportunities for collaboration. It is the front line of many of the challenges just because of that geographic and regional diversity. But it's also potentially a hub for solutions. I think it's also, the Commonwealth GDP combined is far less than the GDP of the United Nations. And yet, actually, it's a laboratory where many of the issues are presented and many of the universities there and other societies are able to create solutions which can be put to much larger gatherings, for example, at the United Nations. There are, in higher education in Commonwealth countries, 4 very large issues, and I'm not going to spend too much time on them because I suspect that they were dealt with earlier this morning, and also I just heard 2 colleagues, Funmi, speaking about the African context. But one of them, of course, is soaring youth population and rising unemployment. 1 in 4 people alive today is a young person. There is a huge increase in unemployment, more than 71 million young people, and there are millions more joining a job market every year. And the point here about this job market, which is also what makes the unemployment figures so fragile, is that that employment market is changing radically too. What will jobs look like in the future? We have increasing evidence, particularly from OECD figures, that by 2050, something like 40% of jobs in OECD countries will be replaced by automation. Now, in a way, one must think that replacing the dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs through artificial intelligence and robotics to create better conditions for work is a wonderful thing. But how is that going to pan out in countries where to get a job requires on tertiary enrollment, and tertiary enrollment, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see, is only 8% compared to 33% globally. I was shocked recently, and I was in a conference in Namibia where I heard the Kenyan University talk, and this Vice-Chancellor was absolutely brilliant. Her university is relatively well-placed, has a good research profile, and is really innovative. And they were talking about how they were using mobile applications to reach students where there was no internet connectivity. And after the talk, I realized that actually it's only 4% in Kenya are enrolled in higher education. So it is an absolutely massive challenge, and a challenge which I think, again, through Commonwealth cooperation, we are well placed as institutions to work together to find solutions for. Because the better the spread of higher education, and the more higher education is established in developing countries, the more prosperous and secure and safe the world will be. And many of the pressing global problems that we have will be solved. And these are UNESCO stats which came out recently that underline this. But there's also a danger I'd like to point out here, which is that on the one hand there is mounting evidence that one needs a tertiary education in this changing world, that tertiary education means that people can develop to their full potential and contribute to that society's development. But because of the extreme poverty in the world today and because of other pressing problems, quite often budgets go to primary education, and there is a danger that the AIDS budgets of many countries will stop prioritising higher education because it's just that much further down the line. So to grapple with the fact that there is such a need for higher education, just a couple of stats. I think, Raj, you alluded to this earlier. The unmet demand in India, for example, is 3 to 4 times the number of the students enrolled. And alongside that, there is a real need for capacity building, not just for providing students with education, but also providing institutions with well-qualified staff, with doctorates, with master's degrees, with professional qualifications. And there are, in Kenya, for example, 1 lecturer to 500 students. There are lots of ways, I think, that universities are beginning to address this. The UK government, DFID, have something called the Sphere programme. King's and other universities have benefited. The ACU is doing a project called Pebble. Most of these projects rely on technology, blended and distance learning. And the Plus Alliance, which I also had the pleasure of being part of when I was at King's, which is of UNSW, Arizona State University and King's College London, are also thinking, I think, in quite creative ways about how they can use the technology and infrastructures that they have as very large institutions to think about how they can work with other networks to supply content for higher education. So technological advances are a challenge, but they're also an opportunity. The Commonwealth, again, as I've said, it is a laboratory. It is the place where most global challenges are seen, and universities have a vital role to play. Technology means an uncertainty to the job market, but they've also got some absolutely wonderful ways of solving problems in this world. And I wanted to just give you 3 examples of this technology. The first one is about the coconut farmers who fight back against a weevil which blights the coconut crop. The device amplifies the crunching sound made by weevils, allowing farmers to detect them at a far earlier stage. And actually, I have to admit that this example I found on a King's College London website before I got my job as vice principal there. And I just thought it was a fantastic example of how technology meets with higher education and the transformative power of research. The second example is of a Sri Lankan scientist supported by a Scholars at Risk program at Harvard University who's building new robots that detect landmines. Through a study of mammals, his robots are becoming self-learning and nimble and equipped with sensitive artificial noses. And the last example, which isn't that easy to see there, I asked a friend who is a dean of natural mathematical sciences, okay, so we're talking about all this technology and artificial intelligence and how the world is going to be transformed and not as we know it. So what is it that you think is really going to change and is really transformative? And he said 5G telecoms. 5G telecoms pave the way for innovations such as tactile remote surgery. And so this, for example, gives an example of how the surgeon has a sense of touch and an essential real-time video feed. So those are just some of the ways in which Commonwealth countries are working together in collaboration using technology. I think there are lots of opportunities. I think the frameworks that bilateral agreements make can be echoed in multilateral frameworks. I don't think there are many of them at the moment. The ACU is working on a Commonwealth-wide recognition framework with UNESCO, which would allow free mobility of students from Commonwealth countries, which would, I think, greatly enhance and address some of the issues around meeting the demand for higher education. There is a Global Challenges Research Fund in the UK, which actively encourages participation, and there are similar research funds in other countries. There is a new idea for an innovation fund, where Commonwealth governments would be asked to put money in to seed fund innovation. And going back to the question of Brexit, surely actually there must be ways in which Commonwealth governments can be encouraged before the CHOGM in April to put funding together to encourage Commonwealth-wide links, based on the fact that we have this shared understanding, we have a Commonwealth Charter, we have a shared language, and therefore, with recognitions frameworks in place as well, we really do have an ease of working with each other across national boundaries. There are probably other opportunities as well, and it's really through the member institutions that those opportunities will arise and be taken forward. I want to close with some remarks about the roles of universities. Not all Commonwealth countries always obey the rule of law, not countries any, and I wanted to point out that the universities in those countries are the essential organs, I think, of freedom of expression. We live in a sharply divided world, and our security and prosperity rely on lessening the inequity and inequality in the world. And I think the themes at CHOGM this year in April, prosperity, renewal, youth and security, will all rely on universities working closely together to try to form some of the solutions we have. Universities promote understanding amid spheres of violent extremism and an increasingly polarized society. Universities in the Commonwealth have a really important role to play in promoting respect and understanding between faiths, beliefs and cultures. Another program we're launching, we've been working with the Foreign Office on a program around tolerance and respect. How does one foster an ability to respect any faith or no faith in an institution? If you look at our website, you'll see that there is a charter that over 90 institutions have signed up to, and we will be running workshops starting off in Malaysia with student leaders who can take back best practice to their institutions. Universities are sometimes said to be a microcosm of wider society. But we do more than simply mirror the conflicts and challenges of a diverse society. We're a test bed for how these might be approached. We are places which are open and where robust discourse is expressly encouraged in a supportive and inclusive environment. For Commonwealth universities, which often exemplify the richness of Commonwealth multiple identities, we find innovative and inclusive approaches to diversity. And it's more than pertinent, it's critical for wider society. By making the most of Commonwealth frameworks and links, there's huge potential for universities to take a leading role, which is why I've quoted Kofi Annan here, who was at our Ghana conference 2 years ago. Universities defend democracy. This is the University of Hong Kong, students probably protesting. They're a wonderful example of Commonwealth values in action, a living laboratory for change and progress, even where governments themselves may falter. You can expel a country from the Commonwealth, but I don't think you'd want to expel the universities. And this is a statue of Cecil Rhodes being removed from Cape Town University, and itself is obviously an issue of controversy about whether we should be taking away our history or not. I'm a historian, I would probably feel differently. But many claim that history's telling of colonial rule underplays the brutality of it. And it's universities themselves, I think, who will ensure that history books reflect the reality of that past. If statues are to be toppled, it will be universities who sound the rallying cry for and against. And I want to end with one particular example of this in action, which was the theme of a talk at Ghana last year, which is about reparative justice and universities. At the University of the West Indies, Vice-Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles is leading a campaign for reparative justice over buried history. And the reparations movement seeks compensation and an unqualified apology from Europe for the enduring sufferings inflicted by slavery. The university's role in leading the reparations movement is inextricably linked to the past of the university, having been a site built on a former slave plantation called Cause Quest. Simon, could I have a glass of water, please? Oh, thank you. That's better. Much better. Thank you. No, I just slowly choking. So the campus's history makes sure that the history of the slave plantation has not been forgotten. And there's an installation there remembering William Quor, who was one of 295 enslaved people at the time of emancipation, who occupied the lands on which the Cave Hill campus has been built, and subsequently became a champion of Afro-Caribbean liberty. So Sir Hilary is a vocal reminder of the critical link between education, inclusivity, and democracy. And I'm going to end by quoting Sir Hilary, because I think it really exemplifies, the aims of what I've been trying to communicate in my talk. Education can alleviate many of the legacies that have resulted from a history of slavery and colonialism. The greater the inclusion of more people into the centre of decision-making, the stronger the democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for reminding us that there's more at stake in international relations simply than transactional benefits or even building a mutual identity. I see a couple of hands coming up already. I'd like to begin the question and answer session with a question. There's a significant opportunity for UK universities and their partners abroad to bid for UK government support for work on development-related higher education. I mean, we're in a period where a window is opened and there are significant public resources available to support the development of large new projects. I mean, think of the position of, say, a postdoc who might be thinking about this area, wanting to work with others, develop a bid, develop a project. What do you think are the values or principles or sort of primary pieces of advice that you would suggest should be taken into account at that point? What should people have in mind when they're starting to work in this area?
Okay. So if you take a postdoc in a sorry, I'm struggling with my voice today, but if you take a postdoc in a university, for example, in the UK, the first thing that you have to think about is a framework that relies on solid partnerships. There is no way that some of this work can be done, for example, increasing the capacity of an institution by training staff to be able to receive their own postdocs back into the university, training PhD students, providing online and distance learning. Many of the transnational education types of activity that takes place can only happen if there is a solid and respected partnership. And that means support from both institutions, clear aims and objectives, and understanding that not each partner is equal in terms of what they have to offer, but they're equal in what they've agreed to do with each other. I think those are the basic tenets of anything actually working well. But I also think that these funding opportunities could perhaps be better communicated. I think there is an issue around the speed in which governments put these funding pots together, and the ability of governments to then communicate those to institutions to allow them to gather the necessary staff to address these problems. And I also think that universities are becoming much better at becoming interdisciplinary and thinking about problem-solving approaches which cross faculties. But again, I'm not sure if that approach is reflected well enough in some of the funding streams available.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. Raj, I think, had the hand up first.
Thank you very much for that really inspiring presentation. 6 years ago, Peter Kellner, writing in The Guardian, said that Commonwealth is sleepwalking into irrelevance. I thought it was a very harsh critique, but you gave a very powerful defense. Now, one of the big challenges of Commonwealth to, let's say, not to sleepwalk into irrelevance is really the disparities and the aspirations of the countries that represent Commonwealth. In fact, arguably, this is the challenge of any regional groupings of any kind, even at the sort of political level. So, particularly with the fact that this is, while it is sort of, it grew out of the larger Commonwealth, the political grouping of it, you have a mandate of the Commonwealth universities. So, the key word that we've been discussing, at least in the higher education context, is the word partnerships. So my question is, given the fact that there is clear distinction between aspirations of the developing countries of the Commonwealth and the advanced economies of the Commonwealth, one of the ways by which this difference could be met is to forge strong, substantive, deep and pervasive partnerships. Unfortunately, the existing narrative is, by and large, in the higher education context, is about students come from the developing Commonwealth countries paying fees to go to the advanced Commonwealth countries for their higher education. Highly expensive and not sustainable. What are the other ways by which we can alternate this paradigm which has created an unsustainable framework of partnership among Commonwealth countries?
Okay, that's a very good question, Raj. I'll try and attempt to answer some of it. I think I'll answer some of it by giving you an example of the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission. It's the UK government's aid budget, which is spent on bringing students from low and middle income countries, ODA-able spend, to the UK for PhDs and master's programs. It is becoming less defensible to just use that modality of global movement. And it doesn't help the institutions or the countries that those students come from necessarily if those students don't go back. So the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission, which is an NDPB, it means it's an arm's-length government body that's administered by the ACU, were really challenged by government to think about the issue of that. And they came up with some very innovative ways which are becoming much more currency of mobility. Split-site PhDs, where students only spend 1 year away from their home institution. That's a wonderful way of building capacity in both countries and building partnerships, because to do that, the student needs to have 2 supervisors. That helps to create a stronger link between the developing and developed countries' partners, and it also creates a flow of other students who will then come after. So split-site PhDs, professional fellowships. These scholarships that are being awarded by the British government, for example, I'm sure that other governments are doing similar things, are now also looking at professional fellowships, fellowships in developing areas. We're also doing online master's degrees now, with some summer schools attached to them, so some blended. So there's a much more of a diversity of approach with an understanding that it's really important to build up the capacity of those institutions in developing countries at the same time as you're building up the capacity of those individual students.
Laurie. Yeah.
I'm just wondering how being in a leadership role for a major international network like the ACU, when you have politicians making comments like Empire 2.0 in the context of the Commonwealth and what it means for this country's foreign policy post-Brexit, how do comments like that play out across the network, and what do you think, how do you think the Commonwealth can respond to the Commonwealth in the 21st century unshackling itself from Great Britain?
Well, I would not agree that the Commonwealth itself wants to unshackle itself from the United Kingdom as a Commonwealth member. And I think that the view of Empire 2.0 is a minority one that is not shared. And I think the best way that Commonwealth countries can demonstrate that is by demonstrating the fact that for them, the UK is one member among 52. So I wouldn't give it too much credence, and I think that again and again, the reason that countries join the Commonwealth, Rwanda, for example, joined the Commonwealth and was not part of a Britain's colonial past. They joined because of that charter, because it gives a voice to small and fragile states, and because also, I think the most important point is that the Commonwealth group of family of nations are able to contribute more, I think, to the solving of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because it's a family of nations underpinned by this charter, than any other grouping can do. And so it's a very powerful union in support of UN goals.
Ian, yeah.
That was a great talk, Joanna, and the power, the potential power of that partnership is extraordinary. If you, and you have a position now where you can influence it, you know the higher education sector incredibly well, what would you like to see the leading research-intensive universities do in countries like the UK, Australia, etc., do to work more effectively with the emerging universities in some of the more disadvantaged areas of the Commonwealth? If there were 1, 2 or 3 things you'd like them to do and commit to, what would they be?
That's a great question. I would like them to solve the problem of the rankings. Many very great research-intensive universities find it difficult to partner with institutions in developing countries because of the issue around rankings, I think, and bringing their status down. I think so. Talking to finding a way of the rankings will never go away, but finding a way for the rankings to appreciate and support partnerships between developing and developed countries, I think would be a really good solution and would really help. I think a proper multilateral framework agreement to enhance Canada, Australia, Singapore, the UK, India institutions working with some of those institutions in the most need-driven economies would be really helpful. And I think that possibly what we're working on is, the second thing then would be for CHOGM to release specific funding for multilateral framework agreements that would encourage that kind of partnership. And thirdly, I think that actually we have a role that we haven't really played that well up until now, and that is to be a much better megaphone for the extraordinary work that already goes on. I think some of those examples I gave of those, the weevil, tackling weevils, tackling landmines, tactile long-distance surgery, I think it was Arizona State's solar-powered technology for being able to provide educational content. You know, these are amazing solutions that universities are already doing. And I think there needs to be a more effective way that we could be promoting that to our governments.
Thank you. Now that you mentioned about the rankings, and there are different rankings with different credibility and applicability. For example, Indian government has started its own ranking of its universities. Is there a stand that ACU would like to take on specific rankings or create its own, because there are so many deficiencies in the existing rankings?
The very last thing I would like the ACU to do while I'm involved with it would be to start a new ranking system. And I don't think anyone would thank me for trying to do so. I think there is a role, though, for us to play in perhaps putting some pressure on rankings, not just the Times Higher, but others, to create some... I think rankings can be really valuable. I think rankings also provide evidence and data to universities and help them understand where they stand, not just against other institutions, but within their own institutions. There's nothing wrong with data and evidence to be used to produce good decision-making. But I think there needs to be, rankings that also understand the unequal size and shape of universities, the need to create policies that encourage equity of access, address the gender balance, have partnerships with institutions in developing countries, doing capacity building. I'd like to see the rankings reflecting some of that partnership work as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very strong argument, and it's inappropriate to include emerging country national universities in global rankings that are based largely on research and reputation that derives from research. Whereas there may be a role for regional rankings, for example, in Africa and Latin America, that's a larger role than the global rankings have. If the right questions are being asked, the right data are being collected and the right comparisons are occurring, then rankings can play a role in encouraging improvements. But people should be comparing like with like. It should be meaningful. They should be, and it should be collegial in that sense. It's possible, I think, providing that the indicators are sufficiently broad and they take into account, the public good aspects like opening access, to design a reasonable ranking, but a global ranking applied willy-nilly everywhere is just destructive.
Sounds like you need to be a consultant for them, like Simon and your centre.
Well, my first experience with this, Joanna, was going to Vietnam in 2008 and to a conference on ranking, and the Deputy Prime Minister had just announced that Vietnam was going to have a university in the top 200 by 2020. That, of course, meant Vietnam National University, and the pressure they were then under was impossible. And so all of the international speakers spent the whole conference saying, forget this policy objective. Don't position Vietnam as part of a global ranking system at this stage of development. Colleagues, yes.
Thanks. Robin Middlehurst. Joanna, is there a role that ACU can also play at the discipline level across higher education institutions? I'm conscious of an example from King's where there's been fantastic development in global dental leadership by bringing global dental leaders from different countries together, and the partnerships across developing and developed countries have been fantastic in terms of investments and youth education and so on. Is that something that you can promote as well?
Sorry, could you just repeat the first bit of the question?
About whether ACU has a role in promoting partnerships within disciplines across the Commonwealth.
I hadn't thought of that before. I'm not sure. I think so. We have communities of practice, so yes. Our communities of practice so far have been around professional services, so human resources, finance, administration. But I'm actually, we have an annual conference every 2 years, which is quite big. Kofi Annan spoke at the one in Ghana 2 years ago. I haven't done my first one yet. And I was thinking that the best way to do that would be to have a much stronger regional base, where we would have leads from our member institutions telling us what the major issues are from their perspectives, so that when you come to an international conference, your regional members have actually informed the content of that. Now that could actually also spill out into disciplinary concerns. The main point, though, I would think I would make about that, because I think most disciplines have their own networks and they know exactly who to speak to across institutions around the world, and they know how to find each other. But I think that there is perhaps too much emphasis, particularly in development politics and development aid, for the global health and security and environment to play a larger role than perhaps the role that arts and humanities and social sciences can also play. And I think we would have an advocacy role in pointing out why the arts and humanities still matter.
Joanna, we're very grateful to you for coming today and for speaking so well to us and for adding considerably to our thinking and our agenda. I'm mindful of the time because we had problems this morning, and we've got 6 people about to speak who are unlikely to be as reticent as you in the use of their time, because they've only got 6 minutes each. So can I once again thank you